Good evening and welcome on behalf of the New York Society Library. I am Sarah Holliday from the library's events department. We are delighted to have joining us from Arizona State University, Dr. Devoney Lozer, who is also known as Stolen Cold Jane Austen, especially on roller skates. In addition to tonight's book, her work includes The Making of Jane Austen, about Austen's influences and early fame, editing the Cambridge Companion to Women's Writing in the Romantic Period, and creating the Jane Austen course offered by the Great Courses. Sister Novelists has garnered praise from Kirkus, whose starred review called it a triumph of literary detective work and storytelling, and the Wall Street Journal, which mentioned compelling biography and a fascinating account. By the way, this library's readers have known the Porter sisters from early on. We have 10 books by Anna Maria Porter in our special collections, and I just this second, while dancing to the music, I just pulled 3 volumes by Jane Porter, including this beautiful early edition of The Scottish Chiefs. So this is from 2 volumes, 1891 edition. So anybody who is a library member, you're welcome to take a look at these, or feel free to be in touch with us if you would like more information in the future, but I just had to brag about that for a moment. I think that gets us ready to meet the Porter sisters, so I will yield the whole digital stage to Dr. Devoney Lozer. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It is just such a pleasure to be with all of you here tonight as part of the New York Society Libraries event series. The Porter sisters never traveled to New York, but I'd like to think that if they had, this library is something they would absolutely have sought out as an important subscription library, right, as it got its start. So I'm very grateful to Sarah Halliday for this chance to talk to you tonight about the once famous and long forgotten Porter sisters, as she mentioned. I'm going to just queue up my slides here. I'm going to do an image-rich talk, so you should now be seeing me and some slides. And I'm going to talk to you, as you see the beautiful book cover there, about this recently published book that Sarah so kindly mentioned, Sister Novelists. So the talk that I've prepared for you tonight is in 3 parts. Part 1 will introduce you to the Porter sisters themselves. The second part places them in context and especially shares some information about the late 18th and 19th century British novel and how we've forgotten many of its pioneering women writers. And the last part, the third part, I'll read an edited excerpt from the book itself. So along the way, I've got these images for you to view, which I hope will bring alive the book and the Porter sisters a bit more than my words alone would do. And then after the talk proper, of course, we should have some time for conversation and exchange. So with that, let's go ahead and begin. So if you're saying to yourself, who are the Porter sisters? I've never even heard of them before this talk. You haven't had a conversation with me before because I would have filled your ears full of information about them. But if that's the case, if you haven't heard them before this talk or registering for this talk, then you're certainly not alone. Even many avid readers and scholarly experts of this era have known very little about them before now. So here's a quick answer to this question. The Porter sisters were among the most famous British novelists of the 19th century, and that's male or female. That's Jane on the left and Anna Maria on the right. In her family, she went by the name Maria, and we know that because in a poem that survives in the letters, she rhymes her name with fire. So she said fire, so she said it, I think, Maria. They were the most celebrated sister novelists before the Brontës. Jane and Maria were most actively publishing in the 1800s, 1810s, and 1820s. And of course, the Brontës didn't start publishing together until the 1840s. But surely Charlotte, Emily, and Anne Brontë were aware of the ways that the Porter sisters had used their status as siblings to further their literary reputations. The Porters, like the Brontës, sometimes published in tandem. So I want to try to give you a quick sense of Jane Porter's fame. In the late 19th century, Jane Porter's stature was similar enough to Jane Austen's that they could be mistaken for one another. And I wanted to show you that in this slide. That's one conclusion we might reach from the printer's errors on this late 19th century title page. And you'll see here Jane Porter's The Scottish Chiefs, which was originally published in 1810, is said to be by the author of Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. So obviously something or someone got a bit confused there, right? It confused enough that these copies were actually sold and circulated. With the benefit of hindsight, we might conclude that at a time when Jane Austen's literary star was rising gradually, Jane Porter's star was gradually falling. I think literary history got it right in elevating Austen. It's an easy argument to make today. But what I hope to persuade you, or at least some of you tonight, is that history got it wrong when it eventually relegated Jane and Maria Porter to literary oblivion. Now, the Porters, as you can see from some of their title pages here, were prolific. They published 26 books separately and together over the course of their decades-long careers. In the United States alone, where they were very popular, 1 million volumes of Jane Porter's books were said to have been printed by 1840. The Porters were once household names, best known for innovative historical novels that many 19th century readers worshipped. Admirers included Queen Victoria, President Andrew Jackson, and novelist William Makepeace Thackeray. Yet the Porter sisters hadn't started out in high life, and quite the opposite. Their family fell into poverty after their army surgeon father's death. The Porters didn't enjoy a clear path to education, genius, or fame. Maria began to publish her writings to support her family at the young age of 14 in 1793, and she published under her own name. Her book was noticed in several of the best review periodicals of the day, but anonymous reviewers were quite cruel. Across the 1790s, reviewers of both sisters' works repeatedly told these ambitious young women that they should give up on novel writing and on having any literary ambitions often. But eventually the Porters won over both the critics and the public, and their heart-rending, uplifting novels of European history, romantic love, and brutal wars were seen as so true to life that some thought it was impossible that these books' authors hadn't been on battlefields themselves. So they also had quite opposite temperaments, something like Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood of Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. Jane Porter was the tall, dark, striking, serious, wise, and introverted sister, and Maria was the family's more fair, light, bright, and sparkling, flirtatious extrovert, as she wore her heart on her sleeve. Yet they were the closest of sisters, and how do we know this? Because they left behind thousands of still unpublished letters. As many as 7,000 family letters and manuscripts ended up in the United States in the mid-20th century. And many of them are actually in New York at the New York Public Library's Pforzheimer collection. In these letters, the sisters confessed everything to each other, from their literary hopes and dreams to their penchant for falling in love with handsome, brilliant cads. They did not choose good men. But my biography of the sisters tells not only the stories of their brilliant literary careers, but of their fraught, secret, and colorful love lives. And let me tell you, I think their romantic lives were in some ways as dramatic and as unlikely as their literary lives. Although both sisters, I should say, were what was then called polite women. That is, they maintained their reputations and were likely chaste. They certainly knew the difference, too, between people who lived as polite and as impolite, because they were bold enough to befriend so-called fallen women, including one very famous royal courtesan, Mrs. Mary Robinson. I'd be happy to say more about that remarkable friendship in our conversation later. So I think it's actually a travesty that before Sister Novelists was published, there was no full-length biography devoted to the Porters' lives and careers. I'm really proud of having put this book together, if you'll allow me to say that, largely from the sisters' massive collection of confessional unpublished correspondence, which you just saw an image of a moment ago. I hope the book will return their stories back where they belong, before the eyes of readers who may still care about some of the same things the Porters themselves cared about. And just to give you a sense of what that is, what those things were, they cared about books, writing, honoring great authors, creating histories, fostering independence and liberty, seizing opportunity, caring for family members, honoring their mentors, fighting sexism, and falling deeply and madly in love, even when it was the most unwise thing that a woman then might do. The sisters eventually found fame, as I've mentioned, but they never made a fortune. That obviously made many obstacles in their lives. Despite their many romantic scrapes, neither sister would end up getting married, which means that they were always each other's most important life partners. And I want to try to give you a sense of just how successful these Porter sisters once were, especially Jane. What I've discovered in the months since the book came out is that those who have heard of the Porters before often know of Jane's most famous novel, The Scottish Chiefs, perhaps because for some of these readers, they themselves are from Scotland or they have Scottish ancestry. Some readers tell me that they have an heirloom copy of this novel that's been handed down to them by relatives. Others were given a copy of the early 20th century illustrated abridgment of the novel, which you see here, published by Scribner's, with its lovely illustrations by the renowned artist N.C. Wyeth. Still other readers tell me that they know of Jane Porter because they loved classics illustrated comic books. This version of The Scottish Chiefs is from the 1950s. And as you might gather from these illustrations, the Scottish Chiefs is a retelling of the story of William Wallace, the 13th century warrior of Scottish independence. Now, he was a real historical figure about whom many legendary stories were passed down. In rewriting his legend and history, Jane Porter interwove truth and fiction. So her Wallace became, for a time, the most popular version of this story, arguably, for more than a century after its first publication. But increasingly, her story, which was once seen as a masterpiece for adults, was gradually transformed into a historic adventure tale for children. And that was absolutely the kiss of death among critics. Critics stop taking it seriously. It stops being taught in colleges and universities. It stops being talked about as much in a serious way at this period. But these two important abridgments of the novel, interesting as they are, don't even show the extent, I think, of the sisters' longtime fame. So I wanted to show you a few more images. So perhaps what might do so more vividly are the dozens and dozens of beautiful 19th century editions published in the US and the UK of the Porter sisters, especially Jane Porter's best-selling books. And I've put some of these on the book's website at sisternovelists.com, but I wanted to pull a few of them out for you here. Scores of late 19th century readers owned and presumably read gorgeous copies of their writings. So the first ones that I pulled up here are Thaddeus of Warsaw, and it was first published in 1803. So these editions I'm showing you were published some 80 or 90 years after the novel first appeared. Thaddeus is about a fictional war hero in 1790s war-torn Poland, which was then in an unsuccessful independence struggle with Russia. And Thaddeus participates in what the character participates in what were real life battles in that war. But Jane Porter researched them very carefully for the book. So there were lots of moments of realism and actual history. Her fictional hero, having lost his Polish family, ends up losing the extensive property too in bloody battle, which means that he becomes a penniless man and decides to become a refugee in England. So the rest of the novel tells his tale of mistreatment and woe, along with a handful of characters who generously help this downtrodden foreign emigre. Very topical subject, I think, today, actually. The hero, Thaddeus, eventually makes a triumphant return to an unknown branch of his family, regains status and fortune, and marries a worthy woman. But you can see from these book covers that some of these editions were actually marketed to young American boys, although Thaddeus of Warsaw had absolutely nothing to do with the American frontier or canoes or campsites. But it was also marketed to girls, too. The novel has some terrific female characters and includes the very intelligent, virtuous heroine and its captivating femme fatale. So Jane Porter's novels attracted countless reprintings, and she and Maria became household names long after their deaths. I want to show you just a few more of these lovely covers too, which are the Scottish Chiefs. And I love that by the time most of these copies were published in the 1880s and 90s, so the novel was already about 70 years old. But you can see from their covers how they were really marketed to contemporary readers, including fashionable young women, including the independent new woman of the late Victorian era, or obviously also some of the editions on the bottom there, I think, are really marketed either to boys and girls or perhaps just to boys. And that makes sense because the novel not only included the Wallace I just spoke about, but also it included a really interesting, strong heroine and an evil femme fatale. It included scenes of admirable and villainous cross-dressing, murders, castles, imprisonments, and political intrigue. I hope this will make you want to read it or at least take a look at it. I think, fans of Outlander might especially grasp what's going on in this one and appreciate what's going on in this one. But you can see the kinds of differences in the readership anticipated even in the late 19th century and by these really interesting covers. So I think one reason why the Porter sisters' fame may be so hard for us to believe now is because the myth eventually took hold that the only early 19th century British women writers active, or especially the novelists who were active or perhaps worth reading, were Austen and Mary Shelley, at least until the arrival of the Brontës. What's odd is that this myth is now so very easily busted. So much data has emerged in recent years to show us that there were actually many more women novelists publishing during this period. But the belief in Austen and Shelley as sort of lone or lonely female novel writers has become so deeply embedded that I think it's become sort of hard for us to shake. I mean, I think we embrace it perhaps in some ways because we must like it. The data is there to say that it's wrong. So perhaps it'll just take some more repetition or reaching new audiences to dislodge this myth. But surely we also need new vivid stories. And that's where I hope the Porter sisters and sister novelists comes in. So now I'd like to look at some of the data in the second part of this talk. It isn't a truth universally acknowledged, although it is actually true that enormous numbers of 19th century British women writers were disappeared from the literary canon, classrooms, and mass readerships by the middle of the 20th century. So it wasn't just the Porter sisters. It happened not only to authors who enjoyed little, moderate, or critical or popular success, but even for those authors who were actually very successful by any metric in their own day. Now, Professor Clifford Siskin has famously called the process of the disappearing of these women writers the Great Forgetting. I think that's just such a memorable, catchy, fabulous phrase. It comes from his 1998 book, which you see here, The Work of Writing, and it's since come to be oft repeated in feminist literary recovery work. And I should add too that Siskin was my dissertation director many years ago at SUNY Stony Brook, and he's now a professor at NYU. So his work has been very deeply influential for me personally. So Siskin identifies the Great Forgetting as something that became the Great Tradition. And there he's invoking the name of literary critic F.R. Leavis and his influential 20th century book about literary canon formation, The Great Tradition. Siskin argues that the Great Forgetting resulted in the neglect of virtually every British women writer from the period 1700 to 1830 who wasn't named Jane Austen. And I think we might add here who wasn't Mary Shelley. But Siskin writes of the Great Forgetting, and this is the quote I pulled out there, clearly then there is much remembering to be done, and admirable progress has recently been made. But my premise for this chapter is that we also need to find out how we forgot. So 25 years after he published this book, both phrases continue to resonate for me and for others. There's much remembering to be done, and we need to find out how we forgot. We still haven't done enough remembering, and we still don't know quite enough about how we forgot. But what we do know with increasing clarity is that the Great Forgetting, all those cumulative little forgettings, was actually experienced not by one or two, but dozens and even hundreds of women novelists. We're coming to the point now where we can say almost precisely how many were forgotten. Pioneering scholarly work has determined there were approximately 3,000, I'm going to get that number right, 3,000 novels published in Britain from the mid-18th to the early 19th centuries. we might think of the work as counting them up as part of the Great Remembering. Trends have emerged. It appears that about 60% of the novels published in the period 1770 to 1819 didn't carry the name of the author on their title pages. So that's a majority, but not an imperative. It means that about 40% of novels were signed by their authors. Now, a well-known epigram tells us that Anonymous was a woman, but evidence about these early novelists suggests that the picture is a lot more complicated. Some novelists, of male or female, chose anonymity very selectively. They used it for some books and not for others. And that's what the Porter sisters did. But there were also cases in which an author waited for a book to go through several editions for a sign of its staying power and success before putting their name to it. That is, before acknowledging their authorship. So individual authors were actually going in and out of anonymity. One really great gift, I think, of the past dozen years for those of us who research, teach, and care about prose fiction is this freely available database, British Fiction 1800 to 29. I think it's fun to search around in, or, it's possible I just have a really warped sense of what's fun. But it allows you to run searches that offer a kind of view of this period from 30,000 feet, as well as one text with details about its critical reception. And I just wanted to pull up what it looks like, the details there from the Scottish Chief. You could read about its advertisements, anecdotes they've collected, libraries that had it in their collections, and information about its publishing history. But what we can tell from the data culled in this set in British fiction is that in the early 19th century, although the novel was often imagined as a female-dominated genre, women were actually not the clear majority, where gender can be identified. And sometimes the novels were both anonymous and gender identified, such as Jane Austen publishing Sense and Sensibility by a Lady. But there was, in fact, from what we could tell from this data set, close to gender parity, that is almost half and half in the first decades of the 19th century. The numerical advantage, as you can see from this pie chart, slightly favors men, 300 identifiably male versus 295 identifiably female novelists, which I think is really interesting. And here's one further little factoid. Male and female novelists then seem to have been publishing novels at different rates of productivity. Among those known to have published 5 or more novels, 2/3 were women. Anna Maria Porter, Maria, earns a spot in the most prolific women of the period. But then things shifted. In the 1820s, the production of novels split further in favor of a clear majority of male novels from what we're beginning to see. Yet there are still educated readers who mistakenly believe that there were very few women writers, or perhaps very few published British women writers across the 19th century. I think the Great Forgetting led us to misremember not only individual women, but the fact that these writers, when they published, were joining a large and successful group. Now, scholars have long been testing theories that the novel shifted from being understood as a feminine to a masculine genre because of the runaway success of Sir Walter Scott. Scott anonymously published his first historical novel, Waverley, in 1814, and he published a dozen more, which collectively came to be known as the Waverley novels. And some today will still repeat, you'll still see this in lots of reputable places, that Scott invented the historical novel. Now, that statement is a myth, and I think it certainly played a role in the Great Forgetting. By making Scott into the originator of the historical novel, lots of things became occluded, and especially women began to be erased from literary histories. There's absolutely no one who got more ripped off by the myth of Scott as the originator of the historical novel than Jane Porter. And here's another beautiful portrait of her there. As I argue in Sister Novelists, neither Scott nor Porter can be said to have invented historical fiction. The first stirrings of that genre arguably got start a lot earlier. Daniel Defoe, Aphra Behn, a lot of these authors were reworking historical materials into fiction. But Jane Porter is a far better candidate than Scott for crediting with inventing the modern historical novel, that is, advancing the techniques of historical fiction that we might understand today. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. Ultimately, Scott really benefited from the Great Forgetting, if he didn't cause it, one way or the other. He began to look as if he came into being out of nowhere, and emerged as this grand historical genius. And then his work started to be contrasted to the supposedly diminutive domestic genius of Jane Austen. So in some senses, the Porter's legacy was, in some senses, Jane Austen's legacy was really helped along by the contrast that was made between her and Scott. Room was made for both of them in literary history. He represented large, she's small, he was masculine, she was feminine. But Jane and Maria Porter, whose books actually combined all of these modes, were decimated by Scott's success in the end. It's a compelling and sometimes tragic, I think, corollary to the story of Austen's becoming an icon. And some of you know that the subject of Austen's rise to fame is near and dear to me through work I did in my previous book, which I put up on the slide there, The Making of Jane Austen. Scott comes off as something of a hero in Jane Austen's critical legacy. He wrote a good review of Emma, for instance. But where the Porters are concerned, it's a lot more complicated. And we may have to dislodge these myths of Scott as originator in order to restore the Porters to the place they deserve. Okay, so in this last part of the talk, I'd like to give you a sense of why the Porter sisters deserve to be remembered. And I'd like to read an edited excerpt from the middle of the book. It's from chapter 17, which is titled Monstrous Literary Vampires, Jane and Maria after Walter Scott, 1814 to 16. So I think instead of prefacing this with further remarks, I'll just jump right in, okay? So here we go. In 1814, another and very different storm was brewing for the Porter sisters, a literary one. The anonymous publication of Walter Scott's best-selling historical novel Waverley and everything that happened after it would change the course of Jane and Maria's careers and legacy. They saw it coming, but they didn't understand its magnitude. Tell Miss Wesley if she does not read Waverley before I see her again, Jane wrote to Maria, I shall think her so great and insensible that I would doom her ever afterwards to read nothing but Caleb's for the rest of her life. Caleb's, or some pronounce it Celeb's, was Hannah More's exceptionally dull novel, Caleb's in Search of a Wife. Jane was making a cruel joke. Hannah More, a celebrated moralist, was a dreadful novelist. To punish a friend by dooming her to read only one terrible novel is great literary snark. The snark was actually even deeper. Jane had published in a magazine a hilarious anonymous spoof of Morris' novel. It was called Hymenaea in Search of a Husband. Yet soon enough, there was nothing funny or self-satisfied in the sisters' conversations about the acknowledged excellence of the historical novel Waverley, or 'Tis 60 Years Since. Waverley follows the adventures of a fictional man caught up in the Jacobite uprising of 1745, the unsuccessful attempt by Bonnie Prince Charlie, the deposed King James II's grandson, to regain the British throne for his father. But Waverley's protagonist, Edward Waverley, rather than being a legendary historical hero like Jane's Wallace, or a glorious fictional one like her Thaddeus, was a wavering upper-class English everyman, blown about by the winds of history. He's impossibly successful at playing both sides. I'll be interested to hear how many of you have read Waverley. He mends national rifts through his marriage, friendships, and political interventions, and thus he does his own unheralded, personal, and behind-the-scenes part to heal Great Britain's wounds. Now, there were significant similarity in methods among Scott's and the Porters' novels. All had interwoven fictional stories of domestic strife and romantic love with horrific battles, moving prison scenes, and inspirational male friendships. The Porters' novels, too, included important historical figures deftly mixed in with fictional characters, all through momentous historical events. Now, these obvious similarities might even have been seen by the Porter sisters as flattering imitation if the Waverley author had only acknowledged their influence. The Waverley author, and again, it was published anonymously, also included an afterword, which was called a postscript, which should have been a preface. That would have been a fine place to mention the Porters. Instead, it renders them almost unnecessary to the tale of the book's composition. The author claims Waverley had been begun long ago and then mislaid, and he said it was unfinished with his waste papers. So it was a convenient claim, and it allowed him to suggest that he had the idea for Waverley many years before the Scottish chiefs, around the time Jane's Thaddeus was published. Of course, it may be true. It's awfully convenient. But even so, there would have been other ways to honor the innovations of the Porters. In that postscript, Scott did mention having been inspired by 3 other women writers, but he entirely neglected to mention Jane and Maria. Yet they were the novelists who most deserved mention there, not only because they were the acknowledged innovators in this historical romance, what we call the historical novel, but because they'd also been Walter Scott's childhood playmates in Edinburgh in the 1780s. His snubbing them in Waverley's postscript was a literary and professional choice, but it would also seem to have been personal. Today, we might call Scott's naming of other women writers a kind of signal boosting. So he signal boosted Maria Edgeworth, Eliza Hamilton, and Anne McVicker Grant. But in ignoring the Porters in his postscript to Waverley, Scott condones the sisters' erasure. And I think, it engages in a literary imitation of their methods that may fall somewhere between borrowing and theft. At least that's how the Porter sisters saw it, and it remains a plausible charge. Whether Scott's sidelining of Jane and Maria was intentional or not, the damage was eventually done. At first, Jane and Maria didn't understand that the author of Waverley was Scott, their Edinburgh childhood acquaintance. He was already famous as a poet, and some immediately suspected that he was the author of Waverley. Jane Austen, for instance, assumed that Scott wrote Waverley. And we have this line, joking line in her letters that he was a threat to her livelihood. She writes, Walter Scott has no business to write novels, especially good ones. He has fame and profit enough as a poet and should not be taking the bread out of other people's mouths. But even for those who didn't recognize the hand of Scott in Waverley's pages, this much was clear. The ground of the literary marketplace for fiction was shifting in 1814, thanks to that very powerful book. So the Porter sisters were already then formidable public figures. They'd earned a high place among Regency London's literary lions, as they were called. So noted writers, celebrities were likened to kings of the jungle, to lions, and of course to animals in a zoo. One of Jane's letters from this period describes having attended a party of 400 people and was chock full of celebrities. A young woman, she reports, had come up to Jane and complimented her, telling her she looked like a queen of kingdoms. Jane cheekily informed their mother of this compliment, saying, "You see, I do not quite look like a dowdy old maid." This was a disarming quip about her old maidenhood, and it was meant to draw a laugh. But it also shows Jane's sensitivity to the ways she was being scrutinized and the stereotypes she was being slotted into as a celebrity. Jane and Maria had both at this point reached the threshold at which an unmarried woman was depreciated as a spinster in her mid to late 30s. After 30, an educated single woman then was supposed to dwindle into a humble helpmate to her extended family. In her letters, as you may remember, Jane Austen even jokes about it. She says, "By the by, as I must leave off being young, I find many douceurs in being a sort of chaperone, for I'm put on the sofa near the fire and can drink as much wine as I like." But these little pleasures of social invisibility open to Austen were closed to the Porter sisters. Fame meant that even if seated on a sofa, Jane and Maria Porter were being closely watched. They also had a fraught relationship to remaining single. Spinsters might be pitied or scorned, but spinster authors were also increasingly and routinely blamed for having brought their supposed unmarriageability onto themselves. The fact that they wrote is what led to their not being marriageable. Maria, however, movingly saw it very differently. She thought the problem was among those doing the blaming. And this is one of my favorite and most difficult quotes from her letters. Public fame, she argued in a heartbreaking letter to a friend, is the death blow to private happiness. Whatever draws her out of the shade, that is, whatever draws a woman out of the shade, drags her into hosts of enemies, enviers, and ridiculers. And it is so natural to men to start at the idea of a woman making herself a public talk, that perhaps the very best of them consider delicacy injured when a woman voluntarily does it. The best of men, then, for her were harmful but inferior. They were harmful and damaging, but she found inferior men, Mariah found inferior men to be vicious. And this is what she had to say about them. Inferior men, Mariah wrote, disliked public women because wishing to keep women subservient from a belief of inferiority, they look upon any approbation of their talents as putting arms into the hands of a slave. Now, Mariah's comparing what were then majority white women writers to enslaved Black people is rightly controversial today as a comparison. The institution of slavery isn't comparable to the profession of authorship. What Mariah's comparison does offer is further insight into what it meant for white women then to liken their pens to swords. She recognized that many elite white men of her day sought to keep down the disempowered, not only by state-sanctioned violent force, but by withholding recognition of their intellectual powers or any proof of it. So Mariah was still creating ideal heroes in her novels at this period, but she'd lost faith in real men. As she wrote to Jane, "My heart begins to fail me now. Indeed, cruel experience makes me distrust all men." Jane, however, retained her belief and capacity for goodness and hoped there might be love, even romantic love, awaiting her in middle age. She wrote to her sister, "All worth was not bound up in the two beloved idols of my youth. God, who made them, has made others also worthy of being loved." Yet it was Mariah, not Jane, who expressed twinges of regret about not marrying, especially because she loved children. Husbands seemed another matter. Mariah believed that by not marrying, she and Jane had actually escaped many kinds of pain. And this is another favorite quote of mine, of Mariah's. "Thank God, my dearest Jane," she wrote, "that although you and I are but too likely to be amongst that despised set of old maids, we are no longer in danger of being tempted to link ourselves for life to a living lump." Mariah told a friend that when she looked around her, she felt she ought to congratulate herself for not tying her life's work and meaning to the hearts of man. The world was less willing to offer its congratulations, although it remained nosy about how these celebrity sisters were managing as middle-aged spinsters. Just 2 years before, a baroness hosting a ball had been so astonished at Mariah's still attractive bosom that she'd accused the novelist of manufacturing her chest. So some women then did so with wax prosthetics. When Mariah assured her ladyship that her bust was real, the baroness had thrust her own hands down the front of Mariah's dress in front of the entire company to determine whether she was telling the truth. So Jane and Mariah understood perfectly well that female authors' personal and literary reputations were fragile and required management. Jane's popularity was so massive that there was almost nowhere to go but down. She was called one of the era's 3 most recognized literary women, with poet and dramatist Joanna Bailey and novelist Mariah Edgeworth. These two, Bailey and Edgeworth, were a decade Jane's senior and respected also for unimpeachable feminine modesty as single women. At a crowded party years before, Jane had looked on as everyone gazed rudely at Mariah Edgeworth. Some even did more than gaze. They attacked her. As Jane put it, they clambered over each other's backs like sheep at the water trough, as Jane said, to exchange a word with this celebrity author. Jane's response seems to have been watch and learn. Across the 1810s, she was especially anxious that she not be accused of self-conceit or arrogance. She managed her comportment and did everything she could to avoid such a charge. They set out to be unfailingly polite and humble sisters in public. In person, they performed expected feminine modesty, but they behaved quite differently under the cover of anonymity. What Jane didn't seem to understand was how quickly the history of the novel she was a part of and had helped to build was fading away. The story of women's great giftedness in novel writing and of her own role in inventing the new species of writing we call historical fiction was eroding thanks to the sensation of Waverley. So Scott hadn't been part of the sisters' lives since their Edinburgh childhoods, but by 1815 he was back in London, and this created some problems for the Porter sisters, and that's the part of this that I'd like to read next. Scott became the most popular poet in Britain until Lord Byron burst on the scene in 1812. In creating his historical poems, he mined previously published events, characters, and materials. He wasn't the only poet doing so, but the Porter sisters thought they saw in his books traces of the methods they used. Borrowing, Jane had once privately called it. Maria used a stronger word, theft. As the sisters' sales soared, this might have just seemed an annoying part of doing literary business, but once they were being measured for a decline in their literary talents as aging spinsters, their sense of things shifted. In April 1815, Jane became irate. She complained to Maria that both Scott and the poet Robert Southey were doing for historical verse what Jane and Maria had done for historical fiction. They lifted their characters from Maria's novel Don Sebastian and from Jane's The Scottish Chiefs. It is monstrous how these poets play the vampire with their works, Jane wrote to Maria. Sometime or other, I think I shall be provoked to give the public the real genealogy of these matters. It was no coincidence that Jane got so angry. 2 weeks earlier, she'd been reunited for the first time since her childhood with Walter Scott himself, who was in London. She learned of him and sought him out. He was a famous poet. She was a famous novelist. Their families had once known each other. Reconnecting seemed obvious, it would seem, at least to Jane. I knew him instantly at the door he was coming out of, Jane told her sister. His picture, but more the face as I had remembered it in Scotland, assured me it was him. He kindly expressed much pleasure in seeing me. I was in Mrs. Patterson's carriage, and tomorrow I call on his wife. Jane felt hopeful that Scott would make things right with her. She told her sister, I doubt not, Maria also told her sister, I doubt not now that he has seen you, he will repent his literary sins against you. The vampirism they charged him with must have been what Maria calls here his literary sin. What his repentance might look like went unsaid. The Porter sisters weren't unrealistic. They knew literary history was full of imitation and recycling, and that the literary marketplace thrived on it. It didn't seem to bother them as long as it furthered, or at least didn't hamper their own reputation. The very week Scott reconnected with Jane Porter, a performance of Wallace or the Hero of Scotland, which was billed as a new grand equestrian spectacle, had been mounted at the Royal Circus. Jane called it a ballet, but it was probably a choreographed horse performance. It was a tribute to Scottish chiefs, so she knew that her work was being emulated. But it didn't cut into the sales of her original novel and might have even enhanced them in a way that the Waverley novel wouldn't have done. That was in direct competition with the Porters' sales. The era's best fiction, most of it female authored, sparked famous men's subsequent work, but the women novelists were the ones beginning to be wrongly described as weak or derivative rather than foundational or inspirational. So Walter Scott returned Jane's visit and spent a full hour in her company. And she wrote, he was very kind, inviting me to visit him in Scotland. He wants grace of manner. He looks and speaks like a scholar, but not like a poet. This is all entre nous. And he certainly wants an air of frankness, which I love. In short, he looks like a man who could play the literary part he has done to me. Again, I repeat, this to yourself alone. Whatever Scott had said, it must not have involved appreciation, gratitude, or remorse. The Waverley novels, and there would grow to be more than 24 of them, were immensely popular. They went through immediate editions, and there was a second one published in the spring of 1815, and it was Guy Mannering, and it was something that both Jane and Mrs. Porter, their mother, read and loved. Maria was some less enthusiastic. She thought the book was crammed with low horrors, but said it made her vividly feel. For Jane, the Waverley author's new work prompted some reflections about differences between women and men as novelists. The more I read men's work of this kind, the more I am convinced that theirs is the province of observation and woman's of imagination. So that wasn't a compliment. What's a novel with inferior imagination? But critics would increasingly claim that the Waverley novels had elevated the genre of fiction, and especially historical fiction, bringing it to a superior new masculine excellence while correcting feminine faults. It would be years before Scott publicly confirmed he was the author who had been called finally the great unknown. And the Porter sisters were skeptical for years that Scott alone was behind these novels. 10 books appeared by the Waverley novelist in 5 years. Mariah herself was a very fast writer. She published 10 books in 20 years. She couldn't believe the novels came from just one pen. I persist in thinking that the works are from a manufactory, she told Jane, that there is a regular firm of writers there. And she wasn't entirely wrong. Scott relied on research assistants, collaborators, and a secretary, and was known to have dictated a novel. By the end of the 1810s, Mariah predicted public taste would fall off, but she was wrong. Public taste lasted. Critics began to forget, ignore, or downplay the inventions of the Porters, crediting instead the great unknown or Scott. Jane, becoming much more disgruntled, redoubled her efforts to get Porter family achievements in the newspapers. She attended fashionable parties she knew would be covered in the press. Mariah's attitude, by contrast, sounded more sadly defeated. She wrote, "If he had the honesty to show that he thought well of our writings by a word or two of such commendation as he liberally gives to works that have no resemblance to his own, I should say the conduct was fair and allowable. But I quarrel with the self-interestedness of valuing the hints we give him, yet never owning that he does." Jane would eventually go directly to the public to set the record straight, just as she threatened, after she grasped the true extent of Scott's neglect, borrowing, theft, or vampirism. But it would take 15 more years for Jane's justified anger to reach that boiling point. Okay, so that's the excerpt. I hope it leaves you wanting more. You might know this line from Austen's Northanger Abbey, from the part where she's defending the genre of the novel and the women writers who've written them so beautifully. The narrator of Northanger Abbey says, "Let us not desert one another. We are an injured body." I'd like to think that Austen would feel the same sort of solidarity with the Porter sisters today, because they paved the way and for so long lost all the credit. So I hope that those of you who care about history-strong women will not desert each other, and that you will want to read sister novelists. I also hope that you'll want to help me get the word out more widely about these wrongly forgotten, fascinating, innovating, and big-hearted literary sisters. I look forward to your questions and our conversation, and after that, perhaps to staying connected through some of these ways and through this worthy library, the New York Society Library. Let's continue to turn the great forgetting into a new great remembering.
Thank you so much. It's absolutely fascinating, and most of the chat is a bunch of people, including me, saying this is so fascinating. And so thank you very much. Yeah, we have a couple of questions here. Let's see. Little bit of follow-up about Walter Scott, not to give him, all the attention, but a little bit. First, wondering about that image of him, which I think we've all seen before. Is that a drawing, a charcoal? It's not a photograph,
No, it's
right?
not a photograph. That one is the famous one that I think, much like Austen's, was touched up from a painting that's in the National Portrait Gallery in London. So I believe the original is there, but that's an engraving that started to be used as frontispiece to a lot of his later editions. And I'm pretty sure that it was touched up a little bit. Maybe there's somebody who's a portrait expert who knows more than that, but that's my best answer about that image of him. It's freely available. That's what I know.
Yeah. Good. So Scott lifted from the Porters. Did he think highly of their writing, or did he just think, I think I'm correctly referencing the question in the chat here. Please correct me if I'm not. Did he think positively of their writing, or did he just say, "Oh, I can do that better"?
So there's one quote from his journal where he complains about Jane's The Scottish Chiefs and her William Wallace. He said, she's turned him into a Christian gentleman and kind of frittered him away. So he's mad that she's made him a little bit more contemporary a character than a 12th, 13th century character. And I don't know exactly the thrust of everything he means by Christian gentleman, but he thinks she's been historically, inaccurate, which, there's something to that. I think any time that we write historical fiction, today, any period, it's a commentary on the present as well as the past. But I think he's being a little ungenerous there, because obviously his own books were doing some of the same kinds of things. And, but that was not public. There is a chapter in Sister Novelists where I talk about what happened when a rumor got back to Jane Porter about something that Sir Walter Scott had said in front of no less a person than King George IV. Someone put him on the spot and said, this Waverley novelist, of course, they all knew it was him, but he still hadn't acknowledged it was him. This Waverley novelist owes everything to the Scottish chiefs, doesn't he? And Scott was apparently said privately, there's something to what you're claiming. So that rumor got back to Jane Porter. And the chapter is about what happens when Jane finally hears these words she's been longing to hear for years. And then there's a chapter about what happened when she finally got pissed off. So, you can continue to follow the story of Scott and her response to Scott in the book.
Excellent. Good question here in the chat. What, if anything, might the mixed experiences of the Porter sisters as literary celebrities in this culture suggest about the decision of a woman like Austen to preserve her anonymity? Women writers, as you've shown, were ubiquitous, but were they generally understood to have a bad time even when professionally successful?
I do think that in many circles, it was really a fraught enterprise to be a public woman. I don't think Anna Maria's quote is off base. I think if you needed the money, however, being able to build not only on your titles, right, like Austen did, right, the author of Sense and Sensibility, the author of Pride and Prejudice and Sensibility, people could follow her work. But once you became a persona, I think your books were worth even more. And Jane Porter discovered this as early as 1801, when Crosby, some people who study Austen know the name of Crosby, this section is in the book too, a publisher, came to her and said, by publishing anonymously, you are putting at risk my profits. If you put your name on the book, it'll sell so much better. And, I think partly it's because the Porter family was starting to be known, but also there was something Crosby felt he could do more to publicize and advance his own profits. So presumably that was true for some novelists and sub-writers too. I think it was a really difficult calculus. Could you make more money if you were successful? Sure. But if you veiled a novel that wasn't successful, I'm sure you were glad, because otherwise you would have had to deal with the wrath of the critics saying another trashy novel, and they were calling you out by name, which often did happen to the Porters. So I think it was, I hope it's a great question, and I hope I'm giving a sense there that it was a financial question and a reputational question, and with not easy answers, but definite costs for anybody who was recognizable in public by name.
So something of a gamble, perhaps.
Yeah, it was a risk, but I think many women took the risk. It wasn't like a risk that no one took. It was a risk that many women took.
Is there one of either of the sisters' novels, just one, that you would single out to read today or to teach in a survey course? Would it be The Scottish Chiefs?
So The Scottish Chiefs has appeared in a modern edition from Broadview Press. And if you're going to read an edition of Scottish Chiefs, that's the one I'd recommend, because it's got great notes and all the things you'd want to know. Like, is this true? Is this false? What's this about? What does this phrase mean? It's Fiona Price edited it for Broadview Press. It's beautiful, and you'll see it's very long. So I have taught it before, but I find that the students, much like teaching Richardson's Clarissa, they think you're nuts and that maybe it's a bit long. So I think teaching the Scottish Chiefs, all of it, might be a bit of an adventure beyond what today's college students would tolerate lengthwise. Yes, I would read that. I would read Thaddeus of Warsaw. There's a great new edition from Tom McLean and Ruth Knezevich that came out of Edinburgh University Press. Same deal, modern edition, all the notes, all the things you might want. But what I've been recommending for people for one-stop shopping for both sisters is one of the novels that they wrote together, Coming Out and The Field of 40 Footsteps. I think both of them are a great example of the sisters' powers. Coming Out is much more in a Jane Austen-y vein, so that'll appeal to people who like that. It has, I think, a little bit more wicked snark in some of the characters. Like there's, this Polish princess, and, there's some really fantastic characters in Coming Out, Mariah's half. The Field of 40 Footsteps is an example of Jane's powers. It's a story based on a historical legend about brothers and a duel and some supernatural events. So I would recommend that for one-stop shopping. But if you want to read the ones everybody thought was great, then yes, probably Scottish Chiefs, Thaddeus of Warsaw, and from Mariah, The Hungarian Brothers, which was her first 1807 historical novel in her sister's vein.
Great. Is it possible to give an approximate, is it possible to give an approximation of their total career earnings? And did their brothers waste 98% of it is the question.
I'm sure it's possible. And this is math that I absolutely should have done. I think it's a little tricky, but what I can tell you is that there was a period when they were being paid 300 or 400 pounds for a novel, which is a lot, more than Jane Austen got, not what Mariah Edgeworth, Frances Burney, and others were getting. But they often sold their copyright, and this is bizarre for us to imagine, but they took what were in effect loans from their publishers and then promised them novels that they would write. I guess it's not bizarre. It's not unlike an advance. I guess we think of a publisher's advance today, but they had to live off of these loans. And so they were getting money that they were using to pay off their brothers' debts. So each of them, I would say, earned over the course of their career. They started out getting 10 pounds for a book. By the end of her career, Jane Porter got 600 pounds for one of her last single authored novels. But almost every payday they got was being used to pay past debts or used to fund what was a very modest life. But, even to live in a cottage with your mother with one servant is often what they had. And sometimes that servant wasn't paid wages. And, that was not cheap. They were trying to live sometimes on 50 pounds a year, which is what a clerk made. And the reason they needed the servant, interestingly, is because otherwise they couldn't write, because they would be constantly answering their own door with people coming to see them, or, especially once they became famous, people coming to get a glimpse of them. So a servant could at least say that they were out or, they weren't at home, as it was put, right? Otherwise, they would get no writing done for those periods where the servant was out on an errand. Anyway, I try to bring the servants into the book and talk about what that meant. But obviously, when we talk about the sisters' poverty, it was a genteel poverty. For the most famous women in the country, some of the most famous women in the country, they were living an incredibly tight financial life. They had food. They just didn't have many creature comforts. And most of it was going to pay off their own debts, their brothers' debts, because their brothers weren't contributing anything to the sisters' upkeep, or contributing very little. It's a complicated story.
So you mentioned the research that Jane Porter did for Thaddeus of Warsaw. Question here in the chat is, what types of documentation about those battles were available to her in England? Is there any hint in her letters of what drew her to write about Poland specifically? I was going to kind of throw into that one of the things that strikes me about several of their topics is that there's a clear, and I don't say this in a bad way, but exoticism to it, that they're not choosing even to write about nearby geographically English history for the most part. They're writing about far-flung history. So research.
Right. And mostly option. European, although they have some things set in Northern Africa, but mostly in Europe they chose. the quick answer to that is that they borrowed books, and sometimes they borrowed them from their own publisher. So they would often, from Longman and Company, end up with copies of books. Sometimes they took, if they actually had to purchase them, they took the price of their books out of whatever their earnings were. But they didn't have easy access to a great library. They relied on wealthy friends or their publisher. But there were certainly histories of this period. You know, I said there were 3,000 novels published in the 18th century by our best guests. There were 10,000 histories of England alone. So just to give you a sense of, you know, the novel was very popular and it was an increasing genre, but in terms of sheer numbers, there were tons of histories out there. So I think the reason that Jane chose Poland has to do with this figure, General Kosciuszko, and Thomas McLean's work is amazing on Kosciuszko. So I hope some of you will follow up with him. But he was a Polish war hero who had also been in the American Revolution. And the sister's brother, Robert, can you believe I did this whole talk without bringing up brother Robert, who was a famous panoramic artist and a travel writer, and ended up becoming a diplomat who married a Russian princess. How can I have waited this long to say Russian princess? That's where that Polish princess in Mariah's book came from a little bit. He definitely was somebody who knew Kosciuszko, had painted Kosciuszko, and they were all very familiar with revolutionary things going on in the 1790s and with Polish independence struggles. It was topical, I guess is what I would say. And that's one thing the sisters did. They chose things that were then hotspots in the late 18th, early 19th century, and then set a novel about them in the past. But the hotspots were contemporary hotspots. So Poland, it's a 1790s story, the Thaddeus of Warsaw, but often the sisters went further back in history.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I do think it sets a model for a lot of more contemporary historical fiction. It's like, let's comment on today.
I mean, I think the late Hilary Mantel also owes a debt of gratitude to the Porter sisters, but I don't think she necessarily, you know, knew that. Unlike Scott, who
you can't blame her for not acknowledging that one.
Right.
She did not. So great. So you talk about their more or less contemporary books that they had access to. Did they have a kind of any classical education? Would they have been able to read somebody like Thucydides or a classical historian?
So I have a section early in the book where I talk about their education. Their charity school was in English, and they never had any schooling in classical languages, and I don't think had much facility in classical languages. And I think they felt the loss of that. I think their brothers probably had a bit. Scott, of course, had a ton. He was going to, you know, for the era, very Tony schools, and the sisters were going to had their only formal education in a charity school. Otherwise, they were self-taught. In Durham, where they lived in, you know, their preteen years, they got access to an amazing library, Bishop Cousins Library, and apparently just read voraciously. But I think they were mostly reading in English. Later, Mariah had gained some facility in French. Jane's French was not so good.
So great question here. One thing that struck me throughout this great book, what an anchor Mrs. Porter was to her daughters, a young widow always petitioning for charity and pensions, supporting her daughters and her sons, having to run a business, having to relocate more than once, providing never-ending financial, emotional, and moral support to Jane and Mariah. Jane Blenkinsop Porter was one of the heroes of sister novelists.
I love that. Whoever said that, I just love that. I absolutely. And what I love about her, and I tried to bring this out in the book, is also her incredible plain spokenness. She was just blunt. When they moved into an apartment, Mrs. Porter said, "This is a dog hole." and you know, Jane tried to put a nicer spin on it and say, it's going to be what we make it. And, you know, it's not just the size of the place, we can make it elegant. But their mother is just, you know, this is a dog hole. But she was very permissive with her daughters too, I think is the negative word we would put on it. But the positive word I would put it is she allowed them independence. She allowed them a kind of personal freedom that is really unusual. And I think it's partly because she was raised by a radical Wilkite and was herself a follower of John Wilkes. Liberty and freedom was like baked into her family's politics. and I think to some of how she ended up raising her children. It worked a lot better with the girls than it did with the boys, I guess is what we could say. If we're going to give her credit for her amazing daughters, then I don't know. Do we need to give her blame for her three, not so amazing sons? I don't know. But I do also see her as an absolute hero. She was a hero. She was left with no money and 5 children under the age of 8. And 3 of them went on to become international celebrities. That's incredible.
That is amazing. Great. So I think we might have just one or two more questions, perhaps, if that works for you. I was going to note, as I did pull up our records of the things that we have in the library's catalog by the Porter sisters, one of the things that pops up is a volume apparently edited by Jane Porter, Sir Edward Seward's narrative of his shipwreck and consequent discovery of certain islands in the Caribbean Sea, with the tales of his residence there and various extraordinary and highly interesting events in his life. From the year 1733 to 1749, as written in his own diary, Ed, by Miss Jane Porter. Does that ring a bell? Do we know
the
anything
story
about
behind that one?
Any way to tell that one briefly?
So it's not by Jane, although she rewrote it and edited it and put her name on it to try to help with sales. It was written by her brother, William, who I haven't mentioned. He was a man who followed in the footsteps of their father and became a surgeon. I do not see him as a very positive force in the lives of the sisters or in Mrs. Porter's lives. And there's a chapter talking about that book and his writing of Sir Edward Seward, which he very much wanted published anonymously. He didn't want his name on it because he wanted his reputation as a surgeon, not as a writer. But he, so the chapter is about when Mrs. Porter is very ill, and all William can talk about is the success of Sir Edward Seward. And, this is a surgeon. This is a son who's a surgeon. And all he could talk about is authorship instead of his sick mother. So he doesn't come off very well. But yeah, there's a chapter on that period from 1830, 1831 about William. So much more I could have put into the book about William, but I think he deserves even less space than Sir Walter Scott in some ways.
Let's blame him for that and not their mother.
And Jane spent the last years of her life living in his home. So there's that section. William does deserve some space. He's just not a character, a person. And I think, as much as we can judge his character from the sisters' letters, who comes off very well.
Interesting. Great. So is there anything else that has not been mentioned that you might like to mention? And I'm just going to drop the name of Mary Robinson in here in case you did want to.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so these incredible letters that are between Mary Robinson and Jane Porter are in the Pforzheimer collection at the New York Public Library. And I'm excited that in a couple of months, I'm going to be there in person. So, if you want to hear another talk in New York area, I'm going to bring out those parts of the biography. But there's a chapter talking about how this royal courtesan and kind of woman beyond the pale, this fallen woman, becomes a mentor to the Porter sisters. They love her. They think she's an incredible genius, but they also have a very polite mentor who wants the Porter sisters, and at this point they're in their teens and early 20s, wants them to have nothing to do with Mrs. Robinson, because if they start to hang out with her, the world's going to assume that they are loose, that they are sexually available, and that they're impolite. And so they have this polite society matron mentor and the genius loving Mary Robinson, Mrs. Robinson mentor. And the chapter is about how those two forces collide in these young women's lives, both on the page in print and in their letters in private, in person, where they just really, I think, suffer a lot emotionally as they try to figure out what to do, to follow what the world and the polite society says, or to follow their heart toward this genius that they think is helping them with their writing.
Yeah. Very, very narrow line of what is appropriate or what is Yeah.
And Mary Robinson was also a novelist, a poet. She wrote a feminist treatise. You know, she wasn't just a famous royal mistress, but you know, that's the thing. That's the first detail I think that often gets mentioned about her, because it's a big deal too. She was also an actress. There's a great biography of her by Paula Byrne, Byrne. Some of you know Paula's work. Some of you in the Austen field know that work. But there's a great Mary Robinson biography by Paula.
Great. Thank you. Dr. Loester, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. Everybody is in the chat saying how fascinating this was, and they're all absolutely correct. So thank you very much for being with us, one and all.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everyone.